He arrived in town like a question without a period. A stranger with slow steps, tired eyes, and a worn notebook tucked under his arm. He didn't speak to anyone. He didn't ask for permission. He just sat on a bench in the central square, where old men played dominoes and children ran around the fountain, and stared at the sky as if reading something there, while the market men whispered and the church ladies clutched their purses tighter. I stood still, watching. Not out of curiosity, but from a restlessness I couldn't explain. There was something in his posture, a mix of weariness and lightness, pain and peace, that made everything around him seem small. He didn't know my name, nor I his. But when our eyes met by chance, for a second too long, I felt as if he'd found me, as if he'd recognized something in me that even I didn't know existed. I spent the whole day trying to forget him. I helped my mother arrange the church pews, smiled at the congregation, answered amen to every sentence my father spoke, but none of it brought me back to where I'd been before. My mind kept drifting to the stranger in the square, to those ink-stained hands, to the comfortable silence that hung between us, even though we hadn't exchanged a word. And that night, as I knelt on my bedroom floor and closed my eyes, I realized that for the first time, I didn't know what to ask God for, because what I wanted didn't fit into the words I'd been taught to say. The next day, I returned to the square earlier than usual, under the pretense of dropping off a book at the community library, but deep down, I just wanted to know if he was still there. And he was, sitting on the same bench, with that same air of someone observing the world from the outside, as if he didn't belong to it. But this time, there was something new. A torn page, folded in half, left on the backrest of the bench beside him. I hesitated, took 2 steps in the opposite direction, as if retreating from a sin, but the paper called to me like a whisper. I glanced around. No one was paying attention. I took it, unfolded it. A short verse, scribbled with haste and soul. God lives in the silence between one glance and the next. No signature. It didn't need one. I knew the moment I read it that it was his. And worse, that it was for me. I tucked the paper into my Bible between the pages of Proverbs, where no one would ever think to look for poetry. I spent the rest of the day carrying that verse in my chest like a sacred secret. I tried to focus on choir practice, on the stews for the community lunch, on my father's tone as he spoke of obedience and holiness. But everything felt so gray compared to that line that wouldn't leave my mind. I felt split in 2, half standing in the church, half sitting on that bench with him, not touching, not speaking, just existing beside someone who saw beyond the surface. That night, as I climbed to the attic where we kept the old hymnals, I pulled the paper from my Bible and reread the verse 20 times, trying to understand how someone I didn't know had managed to capture, in so few words, something I'd never admitted even to myself. The faith I'd been taught was too loud for what I felt inside, and maybe, just maybe, he'd come to remind me of that. The first time he spoke to me was on an afternoon when the sky seemed weary, painted in a dull blue, as if even time was hesitant. I was passing through the square, holding some random book in my hands, a gesture that had become a ritual, almost an excuse, and saw him there, seated as always, but with his eyes fixed on the ground, as if trying to hold onto something slipping through his fingers. As I approached, he looked up and said, in a low, unhurried voice, "Did you read it?" There was no need for context. We both knew what he meant. Every word left in those notes was a thread between 2 solitudes. I stopped. My throat went dry. The world around me kept spinning with its usual haste, but inside, everything paused. I nodded. I didn't smile. I didn't speak, because in that moment any word would have felt too small. He looked at me like I was something rare, not with desire, nor with idolatry, but with the reverence of someone who finds something unexpected and knows to stay quiet so as not to scare it away. Then he just stood, adjusted his worn coat over his shoulders and said, "Thank you." As he walked away, I noticed something on the bench where he'd been sitting, another folded sheet. I picked it up with trembling hands, like someone receiving a dangerous truth. I unfolded it slowly, a single verse, written in blue ink, almost like a confession. Some souls recognize each other before names are even spoken. I slipped the paper into my dress pocket like it was a talisman. I walked home with my feet on the ground and my head in another dimension. At dinner, my father talked about Sunday's sermon. My mother passed the mashed potatoes. Everything seemed the same, but I wasn't. I'd crossed an invisible line, not by doing anything wrong, but by feeling something true. That night, as I climbed the stairs to my room, I knew something inside me had broken, with the softness of a crack in old glass, silent but irreversible. It wasn't pain. It was an awakening. And there, lying in the dark, with the paper still warming my chest, I understood that nothing would ever be the same, because even if I tried to ignore it, hide it, or silence it, a part of me had already chosen to follow that verse, even without knowing where it led. I woke before the sun, as if my body knew the world no longer fit the same routine. I dressed, slowly, folding each piece like the act held some deeper meaning. His verse stayed in my book, tucked between the worn pages of John's Gospel, hidden like a secret only God and I knew, though for the first time, I wasn't sure if God approved or just watched in silence. At breakfast, my father said the usual prayer, but the words passed through me like wind through an open window. He gave thanks for another day of obedience and righteousness, while all I could think of was Jude's eyes and the way he'd said, "Thank you," like he was offering a piece of his own heart. His presence began to fill my thoughts like a breeze slipping through the cracks of an old house. It wasn't a storm. It was something more dangerous. It was constant. And the strangest thing was that I didn't feel guilt, at least not the traditional guilt preached in Sunday sermons. What I felt was a kind of sacred unease, as if I were touching something forbidden, yet it made me more alive. For the first time, I began to wonder if what they'd always called purity was really just the absence of experience, and if maybe, just maybe, faith wasn't only about renunciation, but also about discovery. I returned to the square in the days that followed. Sometimes I saw him, sometimes I didn't. But when he was there, our eyes met with an almost dangerous ease. He didn't call me over. He didn't approach, but there was always something left behind. A note inside a book, a poem scribbled on a loose page, a word written in the corner of the library table. And in each of those words, there was more truth than in all the memorized phrases I'd repeated my whole life. He wrote about absence, the weight of memory, the longing for things that never happened, and I read it all like I was reading myself for the first time. One afternoon, he waited for me outside the little tie shop. He stood there with a book of Emily Dickinson in his hands. He handed it to me without a word. He just smiled and pointed to a marked page. A line was underlined with a fine, deliberate stroke. The soul should always stand ajar, ready to welcome the ecstatic experience. I read it there, in silence, my throat tight. He touched my wrist for a second, as if that was all he could allow himself. A light touch, but one that set fire to what I was still trying to keep under control. That night, locked in my room, I thought of all the stories my father told about wayward paths, about girls who strayed from the light and fell into ruin, and I realized what haunted me wasn't the fear of falling, It was the fear of never having leaped, the fear of living my whole life inside a frame, polishing the same image, never knowing if there was something beyond. And with that realization, a question grew in me like a root breaking through soil. What if what I feel isn't wrong, just different from what I was taught? It was there that a space opened inside me where faith and desire faced each other, without hatred. A space where I no longer knew if I was losing myself or finding myself. But whatever it was, there was no going back to the silence of before. Words began to spill onto the margins of my church notebooks. During choir practice, my mind drifted amid the notes and I found myself sketching curved lines, writing loose phrases I didn't dare say aloud. Phrases heavy with an uncomfortable truth, too beautiful to deny, too intense to hide. Jude had become an invisible presence in my routine, and yet the most solid of all. No matter where I was, he lived in the pause between one thought and the next, in the weight of a sigh I pretended not to let out. My father started to notice, not what was happening exactly, but my absence. The way I spent too much time away from home, lingered longer than usual at the bookstore, how my eyes no longer lit up during sermons. He called me for a talk one Sunday morning. He used gentle words with a firmness only a seasoned preacher can mask under a pastoral tone. He said he felt the enemy was trying to confuse my heart, that there were voices out there pulling me from the divine plan, that certain men didn't come with good intentions. I said nothing, just smiled and thanked him for his concern. But inside, guilt could no longer shape me. His voice sounded more like an echo than a command. That same afternoon, I found Jude near the lake, where people rarely went. He was sitting on the ground, writing with his legs crossed, his brow slightly furrowed as if wrestling with the words. When he saw me, he didn't smile. He just shifted a little so I could sit beside him. We didn't touch. We stayed there, silent, listening to the water and the leaves, until he said, "You've been living in other people's worlds. Have you ever thought about creating your own?" I didn't know how to answer, but those words took root in me. Other people's worlds were exactly where I'd existed until then. My father's world, the church's world, the world of expectations. And maybe for the first time, I wanted a world of my own. One where poetry wasn't sin, where love didn't need confession, where touch wasn't transgression, but a translation of feeling. In the days that followed, the whispers began. Eyes followed me down the church halls some women started avoiding. Me, and even my mother, watched me with more caution. His name, until then kept only within me, began to take shape on others' lips. Jude became a dangerous murmur, a threat. They said he wasn't from here, as if that alone disqualified any virtue. They said he had no family, no steady job, that he lived in the shadow of ideas and books, as if that were a crime. And I, who had so long feared the town's judgment, began to see it differently. For the first time, I saw the hypocrisy beneath the smiles, the rigidity masked as protection, the cowardice dressed as faith. When my father forbade me from going out alone, saying it was to preserve me, I knew I'd crossed a line, not with actions, but with presence, with the simple choice to be near someone who didn't fit the script. And it was in that forced confinement that I understood. They didn't want to protect me. They wanted to silence me. They wanted me to forget there was a world beyond the church walls. But it was too late, because I'd seen it. I touched it, and I wanted it. The night everything fell apart. There were no shouts, no slammed doors, no thunder in the sky. Just a silence so thick it felt tangible. I was in the kitchen, slicing thin pieces of bread for dinner, when my mother walked in, her face pale, an envelope in her hands. She didn't say anything, just placed it on the table. It was a letter, one Jude had left for me inside a library book, marked with a verse I'd underlined back. Someone had found it. Someone had handed it over, and now it was there, in front of them. My parents, the letter, and me. None of us moved. My father came in soon after, his eyes already heavy with judgment. He read it aloud, every word, every line, as if exorcising a demon. But those words didn't shame me. On the contrary, the more he read, the more alive I felt. Because every phrase he spat with anger was made of tenderness, of poetry, of something I recognized as mine. He tried to ask if it was true, but his voice carried condemnation, not curiosity. So I didn't answer. I just stared back at him for the first time without lowering my eyes. And there, without needing to say a word, I made it clear. Yes, it's true. Every word, every feeling. I was locked in my room that night, like a disobedient teenager, not a grown woman. They said it was for my safety, that I needed time to reflect. But the truth was raw. I was a threat, a crack in the stained glass of the perfect image they'd guarded so fiercely. And as the hours passed, with the lights off and the air thin, I knew something in me wouldn't return. I no longer belonged to that house, nor to that doctrine that mistook control for care. I escaped the next day, before sunrise, with a book hidden in my bag and my shoes in my hands to stay quiet. I didn't know where Jude was. I just knew I had to leave. I needed to breathe without weight, walk without fear, feel without guilt. I reached the square, and the bench was empty. The town slept, but inside me, everything was waking. I waited, for hours. The sky lightened slowly, leaves rustling in the late-night breeze. And just as I began to accept he might be gone, I saw his silhouette rounding the corner with that same calm stride. He saw me, stopped. I didn't cry. I didn't run. I just stood, waiting. He came to me slowly, as if asking permission with each step, and when he finally reached me, he only said, "You came." I answered with a whisper that carried my whole life up to that point. I had to. That's when I understood. It wasn't just about poetry or rebellion or even love in the usual sense. It was about choosing myself, about saying yes to me after a lifetime of no's swallowed in devotion, and I said yes. He didn't ask where I wanted to go. He just held out his hand, and I went. We walked through empty streets, steps without a destination, but full of resolve. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid. I felt a cut, a kind of pain that doesn't bleed outward but tears everything inside. As we walked, I thought of my mother making coffee, unaware her daughter was no longer in her room. Of my father opening his Bible with hands stained by control, searching for verses to justify what he never wanted to hear. I thought of the town that watched me grow with bowed head and obedient hands, and that now, inevitably, would start speaking of me with mouths full of scandal and fake concern. But I kept walking, not out of courage, out of exhaustion, because there comes a point when obedience takes more strength than breaking free, and I no longer had the strength to keep pretending that world still fit me. Jude didn't talk much. He just looked at me now and then, as if checking if I was still there, if I still wanted to go on. And I did. Not for him, though I wanted him too, but because my soul, for the first time, wasn't in chains. When the sun rose on the horizon, a piece of me died. The pastor's daughter, the church girl, the young woman who knew verses and expectations by heart. She stayed behind, among the folded sheets of a room where I couldn't breathe, and there, under the light that rose without haste, I knew there was no going back. Even if I wanted to someday, and part of me, deep down, still did, the old path wouldn't recognize me anymore. We sat near the station. We were silent, as always. But now there was a new weight between us. He looked at me like he knew this choice would cost me dearly, and still, he didn't try to dissuade me. He just offered me coffee in a paper cup and said, "They'll hate you for this." I took a moment to reply. Then I murmured, "They already hated me. They just hid it with prayers." And that's when I grasped the gravity of what I was doing. It wasn't just leaving home. It was leaving the role, the mold, the altar, the script. And for someone like me, that's an act of war. But I was tired of being holy and silent, tired of being a light that didn't warm itself. So I took a deep breath, closed my eyes for a moment, and decided if it was to be a fall, let it be on my own feet. If it was to be a sin, let it at least be mine. And when I opened my eyes, he was still there, waiting for me. So I stayed. In the days that followed, the fall wasn't dramatic. There were no sirens, no chases, no desperate letters begging me back. It was crueler than that. It was silence. A heavy, cold silence that came not just from the home I left, but from the whole town. As if everyone had decided in unison to erase me from the landscape. I no longer existed in conversations, in services, in public prayers. I was the daughter who failed, the one who fled, the one who chose the poet over the cross. We rented a simple room on the outskirts of town, far, enough that no one would see us, but close enough that I could still hear, from a distance, the church bells on Sundays. And that hurt, more than I'd imagined it would, because as much as I'd left with my head high, part of me still wanted to be remembered with love. Still wanted my mother to knock on the door, or my father to say my name without spitting condemnation. But none of that happened, and in that void, I began to truly see myself. Jude wrote every day. I watched. Sometimes he read me snippets, sometimes he left papers around the house, like he'd done in the square. But now, his verses weren't summons. They were offerings. They no longer spoke of absence, but of building, of ground, of small daily joys. And even without saying it aloud, we knew it was love. A quiet love, without fanfare. A love that let me breathe. But living outside the known comes at a cost. Sometimes, I'd catch myself trying to recall the sound of my mother's voice saying my name. Other times, I'd dream of returning to the church, and my father would look at me, cry, and say he forgave me. I'd wake up crying, not because I wanted to go back, but because part of me still wanted to be welcomed, even after breaking, away. And that contradiction hurt the most, wanting freedom and at the same time wishing it didn't cost so much. I started writing, little by little, loose words on the backs of bills, thoughts jotted in the corners of book pages, phrases that came without me knowing from where. And Jude said that's how it was. Writing came when pain no longer knew where else to go. So I wrote about what I'd lived, about what I felt, about what I couldn't say aloud when they still asked for prayers in exchange for silence. And that's how I realized that, even having lost a home, I'd gained a voice, and with it, I could rebuild. Not to return, but to move forward. Months later, I returned to the town for the first time. Not because I missed it, but because I needed to look into the eyes of the place where I'd been taught to stay silent and not lower mine anymore. I went alone. Jude stayed behind, not out. Of emotional distance, but because this return was mine, and mine alone. I walked the streets with steady steps, my heart pounding like someone facing a mirror after a long time. The town was the same, the facades, the restrained smiles, the disguised whispers. But I wasn't, past the church. The doors were open, as always. I sat in the back pew. No one recognized me at first, or they pretended not to. The sermon began. My father preached about return, about mercy, about lost sheep. For a moment I thought he might look at me, but he didn't. Not once. Because sometimes pride speaks louder than love. And even knowing that, even though it hurt, I didn't get up. I stayed there, whole, in silence. The same silence that once was a prison and now was a shield. On my way out, I crossed paths with my mother in the side hallway. Our eyes met for a second. She didn't smile, but she didn't turn away either. And in that instant, I understood everything she didn't have the courage to say. That she too felt trapped, that she too had dreamed of running, and that maybe, seeing in me what she couldn't be, she felt more pain than anger. I returned to the room where Jude waited. He didn't ask how it went. He just hugged me, and we stayed there, breathing together without haste. That's what we had now, space to feel. With time, the scars stopped hurting, not because they faded, but because they stopped burning. I started publishing my writing in small blogs, then local magazines, then something bigger. The words that once choked me now found a home on paper. I was invited to speak at women's gatherings, to talk about hard choices, about love that frees, about faith that doesn't imprison. And in every room where they listened, I recognized in their eyes the same knot that once tightened in me. Jude remained my ground, but he was no longer my center. And that was the beauty of it, because the love that holds us doesn't need to bind us. It walks beside us. And if one day he takes another path, I know I won't lose myself, because now I am my own road. I never went back to the house where I grew up, but sometimes, when I pass through the town on my way somewhere else, I look up at the hill where it still stands, and I smile, because it was there that I was shaped, and it was from there that I left to finally become Eleanor, the pastor's daughter, woman of herself, poet too. Today when I write, it's no longer to escape, it's to stay, to plant words where there was once only silence. My name now appears on printed pages, on modest book covers, on invitations signed with respect. But that's not what defines me. What defines me is what no one sees. The calm of sitting alone in a cafe without fear of judgment. The peace of looking in the mirror and recognizing who looks back. Sometimes people ask if I still talk to my father. The answer is no, but it's not hatred. It's distance. A kind of wounded love that chose silence over apology. My mother, though, sends anonymous flowers now and then on dates only the two of us know, and I understand. Each bouquet is a sentence she still can't say aloud. Jude and I go on, not as characters in a fixed romance, but as two presences who've learned to walk side by side without canceling each other out. Sometimes he sleeps beside me. Sometimes he leaves for weeks, riding along roads I don't know. And I stay. Because now I know, someone's absence doesn't have to mean losing myself. I still keep all his notes. They're in a cardboard box at the back of the closet, with my first writings and the letter my father read aloud that night. I don't keep them out of nostalgia. I keep them out of gratitude, because those words were what pushed me out of the invisible prison I'd lived in for so long. And whenever I think of the girl I was, the one who folded church pamphlets with quiet hands and a silent heart, I hug her inside. I tell her it's okay, that she wasn't weak. She just needed time, a verse, a look, and a chance to choose her own story. Now she has it, and I'm proof of that.